But I hope you agree with me that the real treasure for Cypriots is actually what is in our museums, in Cyprus and abroad, and what is in our churches, and actually what is actually buried in Cyprus and waits to be discovered. Because I think that's important for us in terms of knowing who we are as a people and where we're going. We're delighted to have with us today many dignitaries, including the Honorable former Ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus, Mr. Achilles Antoniadis, and his spouse, Mrs. Antoniadis. I think Father Peter Thornburg and Presbyter Elizabeth is here with us. Members of the Hellenic University Clubs of Philadelphia and Delaware. We have students and faculty from all of the major universities in the area, Drexel, Penn, Temple, I believe, and Bryn Mawr. And I also like to acknowledge the family and friends of Ellen Herscher who are here with us today. Thank you for coming. Just a couple of words about today's program. Following Ellen's talk, we'll be accepting questions from the audience for a few minutes, and then we'll all move upstairs to the Egyptian Gallery where we have a nice reception for you. And actually, a surprise, another dose of Cypriot culture, if you like, with some of our youth dancers performing some traditional Cypriot dances. And finally, I will close by thanking the people that made today's event possible. First and foremost, the museum, and Tina Thomason, the Assistant Director for Special Events, and Dr. Brian Rose, who is the Professor of Archaeology and Curator in charge of the Mediterranean section. I'm sure you know that the museum has an excellent collection of Mediterranean antiquities, including Cypriot antiquities. And I urge every one of you who wants to promote Cypriot culture to give a donation to the museum. They're doing this for gratis, so of course your donations are tax exempt. And I would also like to thank, of course, Helen Herscher, who fought a viral infection the last minute to be here with us. Thank you, Ellen. You're a true friend of the society. And last but not least, the Vice President of our society, Dr. Melpo Christofidou Solomidou, who actually spearheaded this event. She took the initiative to organize and promote the event, and who is actually going to introduce today's speaker. Melpo?
Good evening, and thank you all for coming to this event tonight. Allow me to introduce Ellen Herscher to you. Dr. Herscher has specialized in Cypriot archaeology for 40 years. She participated in excavations and research at numerous sites throughout the island, and she even lived there for several years. Her archaeological fieldwork includes sites in Cyprus such as Sotira Kaminouthia, Sanida, Maroni, Episkopi Faneroμένη, Gideon, as well as sites in Greece such as Crete and Corinth. Ellen Herscher has published extensively on the Bronze Age period and on the preservation of archaeological resources. She has over 30 publications, scholarly publications. She has several book reviews and several other publications. Ellen Herscher holds a PhD in classical archaeology from here, from the University of Pennsylvania. She has held Fulbright fellowships in Sweden and in Cyprus. She has actually taught at quite a few universities. She has taught at Cornell. She has taught at the University of Minnesota. She has been a director of international programs for the American Association of Museums. Ellen is a member of the advisory board of Archaeology magazine and has served as a consultant to the State Department and to the Council of American Overseas Research Centers. She's currently a consulting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology right here. Now, Dr. Herscher has been a long-time trustee and officer of the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute, called CARI, I think. I believe I have a slide on that. And she has held various offices at this institute, both at the local and the national level. There's Ellen right there. Now, recently, we celebrated here at this museum under the auspices of CARI and the Embassy of Cyprus in the US, 75 years of American excavations in Cyprus. And of course, Dr. Ellen Herscher was at the forefront of that two-day symposium that we had the pleasure to enjoy right here, in this room, actually. Ellen has also been involved in the selection of antiquities of an antiquity collection and 200 antiquities that were exhibited at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. earlier last year. And our society had the pleasure and the honor to be given a private tour of that exhibit, where Ellen explained to our members of our society details and the background history of all the artifacts in that display. So please join me to Dr. Herscher's presentation tonight. We're all looking forward to it. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and I want to thank Melpo for that nice introduction with some old pictures of me, and and Kostas and the Cyprus Society for inviting me tonight. I'm so glad to be here, and the Cyprus Society is a wonderful group that I got to know last spring, as Melpo mentioned, when they came to Washington. So I'm really glad to be here and also to see some old friends from the museum as well. So most of you probably already know where Cyprus is, but for those of you who don't, it's the third largest island in the Mediterranean. But most importantly, and this is what I really would like to emphasize, it's located at this strategic corner of the Eastern Mediterranean. And if you take a look at really where it is, it's only 40 miles south of the coast of Turkey. It's 59 miles from Syria, right here. And Egypt is not on the map, but Egypt is down there, only 237 miles. So it's really at the crossroads of the three continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and in a very strategic location in the Mediterranean. Partly as a result of its location, Cyprus has had a very rich history and culture from earliest prehistory to the present. But I've discovered during my career that it's a place very little known to most Americans, and probably those of you who come from Cyprus have discovered this as well. It's not even very well known among American archaeologists, and I think part of the reason is because in American academic institutions, it sort of falls through the cracks, in the organizational cracks. It doesn't, either between the classics department or between the Near Eastern department, and as a result, it tends to be ignored. I think that's becoming less and less the case, partly because so much is going on in Cyprus now. But for a very long time, it has been true in academia. So tonight, there's really a lot I could talk about, and it was sort of hard to choose what I would. And what I decided to do is to survey some of the high and low points, to be very honest, of the relationship that Americans have had with the archaeology of Cyprus over the years. On Christmas Day, 1865, Luigi Palma di Cesnola arrived at Larnaca, Cyprus, to become the American consul. Only 7 years earlier, the resourceful Italian had immigrated to the U.S. to seek his fortune. He served in the 4th New York Cavalry during the Civil War. He was taken prisoner at Aldie, Virginia, and reached the rank of colonel. He parlayed this service into his diplomatic appointment, asserting that President Lincoln had promoted him to general before he died, a title that Cesnola used for the rest of his life. I heard a diplomat going back there. Cyprus, in the waning days of the Ottoman Empire, was a desolate place. Much of the diplomatic community had taken up antiquities collecting to relieve the boredom of their official duties, and Cesnola soon joined in with unparalleled thoroughness and gusto, digging up ancient sites throughout the island and purchasing additional quantities of antiquities from local freelance diggers. And what's going on in this picture? We have Cesnola sitting under the umbrella, of course. He wants to stay out of the sun. And these are his workmen walking across this plain. And you see the long poles that they're carrying. Well, the purpose of these poles is that as they walk across this flat area, they're sticking those poles into the ground. And when they hit an open space, a hole under the ground, they know that there's an ancient tomb under there. And so that's how they know where to dig for the antiquities. This is actually a method that is still used today by looters in a lot of countries. So here's Cesnola with some of his antiquities that he found. And in addition to digging them up, he also purchased them from local people who would go out and just dig them up too, wherever they happened to find them. Acting as teacher and guide for Cesnola and all the Europeans was Dimitrios Piridis, a leading citizen of Larnaca, himself an avid collector, and later one of the founders of the Cyprus Museum. Over the course of his 11 years in Cyprus, Cesnola claimed to have amassed a collection of 35,000 objects, circumstantial evidence that his methods were far from meticulous, despite his publication of a book that attempted to cast his discoveries in a scientific light. And this is one of the illustrations from the book. And if you look at these, you say, oh, well, he's giving a scientific drawing of his excavation. And you see this tomb shaft and the workers lowering other workers down here and so on. Well, this is totally incorrect because no tombs in Cyprus are that deep underground. And so this is just entirely made up in order to look like a scientific book. And here's the cover of the book and some other illustrations. His most sensational discovery, the so-called treasure of Curium, was Cesnola's competitive response to Heinrich Schliemann's excavations of a treasure at Troy, and the Trojan treasure is very well known. In fact, the hundreds of artifacts that Cesnola reported as coming from a single underground temple that he had excavated at the site of ancient Kurion, these are now known to be a random assemblage of objects of various dates collected from many different places. First and foremost, Cesnola saw his collection as a meal ticket, a means to attain social position and financial security. Thus, increasingly eager to escape Cyprus, he began to hawk the collection to all the major museums of Europe. A few small sales were made, but no institution was willing to pay the price that Cesnola wanted for the bulk of the collection. In the end, only one buyer stepped up, a group of wealthy American businessmen of the Gilded Age who felt that New York should become a cultural center as well as a business center, and thus needed an important museum of its own. A deal was struck for approximately 16,000 objects. Cesnola accepted a much reduced price and returned to the United States in 1877 as the director of the newly founded Metropolitan Museum of Art. He had thwarted Ottoman authorities to remove his collection from Cyprus, and it became the centerpiece of the new institution. The Cesnola collection caused an immediate sensation, but the grand opening of the museum's new building on Central Park in March 1880 was soon followed by vehement attacks on Cesnola's methodology and veracity. These are just a few views of the museum when it opened in 1880, and you see that the entire first floor was filled with cases of the Cesnola collection. However, by the 1920s, aesthetic taste had turned away from Cypriot art, and the Met had moved on to other areas of collecting. In 1928, the museum sold thousands of objects described as duplicates at public auction. And as a result of this auction, the Cesnola collection, or much of it, became dispersed very widely in North America. There are many institutions that still hold pieces of it. Here's the cover of one of the sales catalogs. And Cesnola, it's advertised as a sale of duplicates. For an archaeologist, there's no such thing as a duplicate. But the objects up here will give you a sense. This is one of the barrel jugs from the Cesnola collection, still in the Met. This is a jug that's now in the Penn Museum, which was derived at that auction. And you see they're quite similar. The one that was kept is very, actually finer painting and much more elaborate with a strainer spout at the top and so on. Also, from that auction, Bryn Mawr holds a number of Cypriot objects, either directly or indirectly from the Cesnola auction of 1928. And I think this is just part of their webpage from Bryn Mawr, and I think it shows how, even though Cesnola's methods were not very scientific and so on, that the material can still be used for educational purposes today if it's properly treated and seriously studied. Eventually, most of the Cesnola collection remaining at the Met was removed from public display. It was not until 2000, the year 2000, that the most important artifacts were reinstalled in 4 new Cypriot galleries and a new selective catalog published. Interestingly, the lead funding for the new galleries came from Cypriot donors, a gesture that would seem rather anomalous in an era when most source nations have been demanding that their purloined antiquities be given back to them. The excesses of the late 19th century by Cesnola and his peers had led to new antiquities laws when Britain took control of Cyprus from the Ottomans. These laws strictly prohibited the export of antiquities. But in 1926, lobbying by a prominent Cypriot, Louki Zenon Perides, grandson of the Cypriot antiquarian who had assisted Cesnola, and also a friend of the Crown Prince of Sweden, the Crown Prince who wanted antiquities for his national museum, led to another law change. And this picture shows the Perides family. Here's Louki Z here, other members of the family. In the center is the Crown Prince, Adolf Gustaf of Sweden, later the king. And then there are also 2 archaeologists in this picture, just to point them out, Einar Jerstedt and Eric Schirkvist. And so these are very prominent Cypriot family still living today in Larnaca. This new law allowed for fines from authorized archaeological expeditions to be divided between the fledgling Cyprus Museum and the foreign excavators' institutions. This opened the door to the Swedish Cyprus expedition, who over the course of 4 years brought real scientific archaeology to Cyprus and investigated sites throughout the island. When they departed in 1931, they took 771 crates of artifacts with them to Stockholm. So when the next generation of American archaeologists returned to Cyprus, both the island and their discipline had changed substantially from the days of Cesnola. Cyprus was now a British colony, and archaeological methods were now scientific, with careful recording and oversight by the local authorities. In 1931, the University of Pennsylvania Museum launched an expedition to Cyprus that continued until 1953, with a brief interruption for World War II. It first focused on cemetery sites, since cemeteries are most likely to produce intact artifacts around the village of Lapithos on the north coast. And here's a view of Lapithos village and its surroundings. Some of you are familiar with this, I'm sure. Since the museum itself had no classical archaeologists on its staff, it reached out to the American School of Classical Studies in Athens for personnel. The team was led by Bert Hodge Hill, past director of the American School in Athens and the Corinth excavations. And the team was completed by 3 young women graduate students, also with experience at American excavations in Greece. This group photo is a photo of the Athenian Agora team, excavation team, from 1933, and our 2 Cyprus individuals, along with Dorothy Cox. At Vrisi Tubarba, the site near the sea, they excavated 38 chamber tombs of the early and middle Bronze Age. One of their finds, an imported pot from Crete, remains one of the most important discoveries ever made in Cyprus. Here's some of the cemetery, showing the typical Cypriot rock-cut chamber tombs. And here's just one example of one of the finer pots. This is in the Cyprus Museum, on display in the second room of the museum. And this is the Minoan Pod, also on display in the same room of the Cyprus Museum. This is important because it shows the first direct contact that we have evidence for between the Aegean and Cyprus, so dating to around 2000 BC. At 2 different Iron Age sites, they excavated an additional 36 tombs. I'm very glad Ms. Stella Diakou is here in the audience today, a Cypriot student at Bryn Mawr who is working on this material for her dissertation. The main focus of Penn's work, beginning in 1934, was Kourion on the south coast, one of the island's ancient city kingdoms. In fact, the same site where Cesnola had claimed to find his treasure. And here you see Cesnola, as usual, he found a tree here. He didn't need an umbrella, sitting under the tree, and he actually has binoculars watching his workmen who are working somewhere off here at some distance. And here's the Penn excavations, and you recognize the same cliffs of Kourion in these pictures. Penn's aim was not treasure, but to explore the entire history of a single site. In addition to Hill, the leaders of the Penn team were George McFadden, a wealthy Philadelphia heir to a cotton fortune, who provided at least half the finances for the project, and John Franklin Daniel, a brilliant graduate student with a gift for languages and decipherment. During World War II, both McFadden and Daniel, and at least 2 of the women archaeologists from the team, joined the OSS and, based in Cairo, carried out intelligence work. McFadden used his personal yacht, the Samothrace, to ferry supplies and personnel from the war effort. And there's just been a wonderful book published on this subject, talking about these people and their colleagues as in their service to the OSS in World War II, which is a fascinating book by Susan Allen. Back in those days, when workmen could be hired for $35 a week, and Penn excavated a very large part of the city site. And just to give you some idea of the scale of the work that could go on back in those days, these, re-erecting columns that had fallen over, you see the little train track for removing earth, and so on. Most excavations are not done like this anymore. On the Acropolis, first of all, on the Acropolis, and here's the Kourion Acropolis again, up here in this area is where they excavated. And this is a view, the bottom view is taken from the top of the Acropolis, looking down at where the ancient harbor was. So most of the first excavations they did were on the Acropolis. This included a theater. This has been reconstructed, but I'm sure some of you have been there to see various performances today. And they excavated on the Acropolis a number of houses and public buildings with mosaics. Here's one of the private houses, and one of the public buildings. Fantastic views for all these houses, and would have been a nice place to live. Penn began excavation of an early Christian basilica, which was later completed by Dumbarton Oaks. This has just been published just about 2 years ago. Outside the city walls, Penn excavated the stadium and did extensive excavations in the sanctuary of Apollo Hylates. So here we have the stadium, really quite well preserved. And this gives you a sense of the entire site. Here's the Acropolis with the areas that we have mentioned, the theater over here, right here. Some of the mosaics are here and on down this road. This is the ancient forum right here in the center. So all this is the Acropolis, the harbor down below, and then outside the walls, the stadium here. The gate was somewhere around here. The stadium, and then off in this direction, the sanctuary of Apollo Hylates. One of the most important ancient sanctuaries in the Greek world in general, but certainly in Cyprus. I don't know if you can see this plan of the sanctuary down here, but most of the buildings that you see in the pictures and the architecture with columns and so on, all of those buildings are really not the sanctuary proper. Those are the buildings that were the accommodations, the facilities for all of the pilgrims who came to the sanctuary. And so they needed places to stay overnight, their houses for the priests, their public baths. They're all the tourist facilities that a major, essentially a tourist center, would need. And so the religious structures are actually very minor. This is what you'll see if you go to the site, and you can see it's been partly reconstructed. This is a small temple, but this was not built until the Roman period. This sanctuary was first founded probably in the 8th century BC. There was no real temples up until the Roman times, and it looked like this. The typical Cypriot sanctuary is an open-air sanctuary. That is a sacred enclosure that would just be marked off by a wall of some kind that delineated where the sacred space was. And the worship actually went on in the open air within those walls. And so this is the archaic, the original sanctuary, and you see the old walls, and the worship went on in this open space. This is not that it wasn't excavated, it's just there's nothing there because it's sacred open space. The finds from the sanctuary, of course, are many votive finds, the offerings that the pilgrims would bring and donate to the god. Probably the most common kind of offering is like this little horse and rider figurine. This is a fairly simple one. Some of them have chariots and double teams of horses and so on, but hundreds and hundreds, I guess thousands of those little horse and rider figurines. Clearly what the god Apollo preferred as his offering there. Kourion today is the most popular archaeological site in Cyprus, with nearly 250,000 visitors in 2010. In its effort to explore the entire history of occupation in the Kourion area. Penn also sponsored excavations at the nearby Neolithic site of Sotira Tepes, carried out by the Cypriot archaeologist Porphyrios Dikios. The site is actually on the top of this little hill here, just right up at the tip top. And here you see the site, and the view from the site looking down. This is looking to the south. Kourion itself would be down here on the seacoast. And you see the architecture of this time period around 2,500 up through 4,000, back to 4,000 BC. Many of these little houses. And here's some of these ceramics. These examples are in the Cyprus Museum. Penn also excavated at Kourion's late Bronze Age predecessor, known as Bamboula in Episcopi village, where important discoveries of Cyprus's earliest writing and seal use were found. And this plan gives you another sense of the overall layout of these excavations. Kourion, the city site, the Acropolis, stadium over here to the west, and the Sanctuary of Apollo over here. This is the seacoast down here, the Kouros River, Bamboula up here, and the modern village of Episcopi. These are pictures of Bamboula, the site. Unfortunately, I guess in some area you would say these are rather romantic-looking pictures. They're rather not very well maintained, not very well cleaned, not very well conserved over the years. The site was really let to decay, but it looks pretty with all the spring flowers. The finds, as I said, were extremely important. Earliest evidence for writing, John Franklin Daniel was one of the great experts on the Cypriot earliest script, and seal use was very abundant at this site and continues to be studied today. And many Mycenaean imports. This is a Mycenaean vessel from Bamboula, and some of the other finds. You see an impressed pithos sherd with little figures on it. This was made by rolling a seal impression over the wet clay of that vessel. Penn also explored a rich geometric period cemetery below the Acropolis. And again, you see the layout of the site, the theater, baths, and so on here, the agora, stadium over here. And here was this important geometric period cemetery. This is one of the finds also in the Cyprus Museum from that cemetery. Bamboula and Kalariziki have been associated by archaeologists from the beginning with perhaps the earliest coming of the Greeks to Cyprus. This is not really believed anymore, but at the time they were excavated, they were some of the earliest evidence for abundant Mycenaean imports and perhaps the earliest writing systems. The house that McFadden built for his own use was bequeathed to Cyprus and now serves as a small local museum. Daniel was buried in the local churchyard following his untimely death in 1948. And finds from all these sites that I've mentioned are also here in the museum, some of them on display. Subsequent American and Cypriot excavations in the Kourion area have continued to fill in the long, uninterrupted history of this important city kingdoms, from excavations of early and Middle Bronze Age settlements to a medieval sugar factory. Cypriot independence, granted by Britain in 1960, was followed almost immediately by a breakdown of its constitution, originally intended to be carefully balanced between the Greek Cypriot majority and the Turkish Cypriot minority. In 1963, intercommunal violence led to the withdrawal of many Turkish Cypriots into enclaved villages and zones where the official government authorities could not exert control. For archaeology, this was the beginning of a disastrous period from the 1960s into the 1970s, when the looting of archaeological sites became rampant, leading to the destruction of many sites and the loss of untold information. The enclaved areas' withdrawal into limited zones was part of the reason, and it's also the fact that much of Cyprus is still very remote and not accessible either, in any case, very easily. This is an area near the south coast, and you can see just how empty and remote it is with these little dirt tracks. This is a Land Rover down here, and this is one of the areas that was very severely looted during the 1970s. And here's an archaeologist, just to give you an idea of what the looting of these tombs is like when you see it. You see the tombs. This is a whole vast cemetery that's been looted. This is near Margi, south of Nicosia. And you can see the holes where the tombs were, and the archaeologists picking up some of the broken sherds that were left over. Some more examples, and you see that the looters just leave behind the broken things, the plain things that they can't sell. So they take the good objects, the things that are saleable, and leave these broken fragments behind. And here's another with some of the sherds just left around where this tomb has been cleaned out. The looting was fueled by a new wave of antiquities collecting on the island, with foreigners, including American diplomats and Cypriots, vying with one another for the best items, as in the time of Cesnola. The Cypriot government actually encouraged the local Cypriot collecting, concluding that it was better to have the artifacts kept on the island rather than disappear into the international market. The examples I'm showing have now surfaced in the Getty Museum in Malibu and in Cypriot and Greek institutions. These items are in the Getty Museum, and these are in the Cyprus Museum, the Parides collection, and in a Greek museum today. They are all masterpieces of Cypriot Bronze Age art, but unfortunately, we know nothing about their origin or function within their society. Since the founding of the Republic of Cyprus in 1960, Cypriot authorities have been extremely welcoming to foreign scholars and archaeologists, and have encouraged foreign expeditions to work on the island. The result has been a flourishing of international archaeology and recognition of the pivotal role played by Cyprus throughout its history, knowledge unimagined in the time of Cesnola. As examples, I want to briefly survey 3 of the most significant American excavations in recent years. First of all, one bright spot from the late 1960s, which vividly shows what can be achieved by meticulous scientific excavation in contrast to the destruction of looting. This is the ship found off the north coast near the harbor of Kyrenia. It was excavated by the Institute of Nautical Archaeology under the direction of Michael Katzeff, who was a Penn graduate student when he began this. Here's the ship underwater in the course of being excavated. And here is the hull of the ship as it was being reconstructed. You see the hull underwater. This is after all the cargo had been cleared away. Of course, the cargo, which we'll see in a second, originally was piled up from where it was in the hold of the ship when it sank. This hull was not brought up in one piece like you see it, but what happened is each individual piece of wood was brought up separately and of course had to be labeled and tagged and recorded as to where it had originally been. Those pieces of wood, of course, were all waterlogged. They had to be conserved for several years. Once the conservation was complete, then they reconstructed the hull of the ship back to its original condition. And that's what's happening in this picture, showing them reconstructing it. And amazing amounts of information about ancient ship construction was acquired from this excavation. You see here the mast step within the hull of the ship. Just one of the details that was so important and had not been preserved in other cases in ancient ships. The ship was built in the late 4th century and sank in the early 3rd century. In addition to the study of the hull itself, there have been extensive studies of the cargo. Here are some of the amphoras that were part of the cargo. The different shapes of amphoras reflect the different locations where the contents probably originated from, although amphoras were also reused. But most locations in the Aegean and in the Eastern Mediterranean had their own style of amphora type so that you could tell where it had come from. This was a half-scale reproduction of the ship that was built called the Kyrenia II. And using that reproduction, a number of archaeologists and sailors and people connected with the project did test sailing, because nobody knows how these ships were rigged or anything about the parts of them that aren't preserved anymore. So they did many experimental sails and attempts to figure out more about what ancient sailing was like. And a great deal of information. One thing they learned the first time they tried to load it with cargo is that it almost sank. So that was one trial and error that taught them something. Here is the director of the excavation, Michael Katsev, showing Archbishop Makarios, the first president of Cyprus, who came onto their diving barge and looking at some of the finds just as they had been brought up from the seabed while the excavation was going on. The Kyrenia ship is a major tourist attraction, and after it was completed, it was housed, the first picture you saw with the hull, it's housed in the Kyrenia Castle today. There's a special gallery built for it. It's right here within the walls of the castle. And that's where it is today. Of course, now it's in the Turkish-controlled north of Cyprus. The next excavation I want to mention is at the far southern tip of Cyprus on the Akrotiri Peninsula. The name of the site is Akrotiri Peninsula. It was excavated by the University of Nevada, Reno, under the direction of Alan Simmons. And you see the site, it clings to the side of this cliff. It's a rock shelter campsite dated to the 11th millennium BC. Here they are digging the site. And it demonstrated, first of all, this excavation pushed back the ancient history of Cyprus by about 4,000 years, at least, 5 to 4,000 years. Nobody thought that there had been human activity on Cyprus as early as the 11th millennium BC. It also, what was found there is huge numbers of animal bones, pygmy hippopotami and pygmy elephants. Here's one of the skulls of an elephant, and just piles and piles of these bones. And they could tell that the bones had been subject to human activity. Basically, the human beings had been killing these animals and eating them, butchering them and eating them. And so this was the evidence. No human beings, no settlements, no houses, no nothing was found. Just this evidence for human activity. It's believed now by the excavators that it was these humans who, of course, encountered these animals that had never seen human beings before and didn't know they were trouble, just were easily slaughtered by the humans and, of course, became extinct thereafter. Here are some of the bones in the process of being studied by the archaeologists, and this is just a very small portion of them. Quite a job. And here is a visit from another president of Cyprus, George Vasiliou, visiting the site with the excavator Alan Simmons. And I have never visited this site. I'm afraid of heights. It doesn't look like much fun, but the president gets high marks. Lastly, one current project of particular significance. This is at Athienu, also known as Golgoi, which is a site where most of the finest sculpture in the Cesnola collection was found. The Athienu Archaeological Project, sponsored by Davidson College, is also finding sculpture. Not quite as great as what Cesnola found, but they're finding it. And they're also finding pits left by Cesnola's workers. But Davidson's techniques, of course, are much more scientific. And among other things, they've uncovered the actual sanctuary there, which was very long-lived, and which was, of course, the reason for the offerings of all these sculptures. It's a typical Cypriot type, and this is just one phase of the sanctuary. They've also uncovered a number of chamber tombs. The roof is constructed to protect the tomb so that tourists can visit it today. And some of the little votive offerings. This shows a figure with a bull's mask. So this must have been part of the rituals that were associated with it. Perhaps even more importantly, the Athieno project has conducted a field school for students for the last 20 years, so that over the course of those years, they have trained hundreds of Cypriot and American students in archaeology, and this is an ongoing project today. The director is Michael Tomazou, a Bryn Mawr PhD. His professor is in the audience today, and his origins is his family background is from Athienu village, so he has a ready-made good relationship with the village, and the village has been extremely supportive of the excavation. And I mentioned this project not just for the training of students, but because of the way in which the cooperative relationship with the village has been developed by Michael Tomazou and the local village leadership. Recently, the village has built a new building there, which the excavation uses as a museum, laboratory space, sort of a town hall, general public building. And it's a wonderful example of collaboration between the two. The political division of 1974 has caused severe problems for archaeology. Many reasons for this. As an archaeologist, foremost to me is that one can no longer study Cypriot culture as a whole. Even though it is a single island, it's one island with a single culture. But it's no longer possible to excavate in the north or to have access to the museums that were in the north. Another real problem is that the names of places in the north have been changed to Turkish names. And so even going back to old archaeological literature where you're talking about the site with a certain name, you can't even go and find that place very easily anymore because the names have been erased from the landscape. This situation, the divided situation, has also created conservation problems for the sites. The Department of Antiquities no longer is involved with the sites in the north, but the Turkish Cypriot authorities are very economically depressed, and there has not been the means to keep up all the sites. One example of a particular conservation problem is the Kyrenia ship that we looked at a minute ago. I talked about the very complex conservation needed to conserve that ship in the first place, but it needs continuing maintenance. It needs to be in a certain atmosphere. And right now, the ship is quite threatened from what I hear from those people who've worked on it. So these are just some of the problems. It is not a good situation for archaeology. It's not a good situation for the Cypriots, of course, either. But my feeling is that if Cyprus's cultural heritage as a whole is to be saved, a way must be found, short of a full political solution, which of course would be the best thing. There needs a way to be found to work together bicommunally, perhaps under UN auspices. Currently, one important way that the United States is assisting in the protection of Cyprus's heritage is through participation in the UNESCO Cultural Property Convention. This relationship, this convention, has resulted in a series of bilateral agreements through which the United States restricts imports of Cypriot artifacts unless they have been legally exported from Cyprus. And the point of this is it's intended to discourage looting, looting of sites, based on the principle that restricting the demand for artifacts in this country, for one, will deter the looting that supplies that market. And that's the basis for this kind of agreement. This just summarizes what has gone on up until now. This convention was approved by UNESCO in 1970. It was ratified by the United States in 1983. In 1999, the U.S. put the first emergency import restrictions on Cypriot artifacts, and it was specifically Byzantine and medieval Greek Christian material at that time. This was broadened in 2002 and renewed in 2007 with further broadening, which was a full agreement restricting pretty much any class of archaeological artifact from coming into the United States, unless it could be proved to have been legally exported from Cyprus. And I should add, this is not retroactive, so it doesn't, it's only after the date of these agreements. It doesn't go back to Cesnola or anybody else before those dates. This arrangement, these agreements are administered by the U.S. State Department. This is part of their website, and you can find all the information about it there. And also on the website, you will find lists of all of the restricted kinds of artifacts. And so this is just a teeny, teeny bit of all these extensive listings of the kind of antiquities that are restricted from entrance in the United States. This agreement, the most recent one, is actually coming up for renewal this year. The current one expires, I believe, in July 2012. And as chance would have it, there's actually a meeting Wednesday next week at which the Cypriot government is going to be presenting its request for the agreement to be renewed. I'm going to be testifying at a public hearing there. I know some other people here tonight are as well. And so this is a very current topic. And Cyprus will make its request why these agreements should be renewed, saying basically we still have a problem with looting in Cyprus, and this is helpful to us in trying to stop this problem. And it will be reviewed, it will be deliberated and discussed by a special presidentially appointed committee, and eventually they will decide whether the agreement will be renewed. So stay tuned for that. Finally, I want to mention the exhibition, which Melpo already did, that opened in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 2010. And I think this exhibition shows just how far things have come since the days of Cesnola. For this exhibition, the government of Cyprus loaned about 260 of its finest artifacts, its finest antiquities, almost all of them from scientifically excavated sites. never before out of Cyprus. And many of the finds in the exhibition did come from American excavated sites as well, but from sites from many different countries' projects, including some of the hippo bones that I showed you a minute ago were in the exhibition. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides of some of the artifacts, and it was hard to know what to pick from those 260. But I thought I would pick out a couple of themes. This one I call Cypriots Through the Ages. And this is one of the earliest human representations that's known from Cyprus, about 8,000 BC, and some more recent ones. And this one I call Crossroads, Cyprus Crossroads of the Mediterranean. And again, it reflects some of the most important aspects of Cyprus, this mixture of cultures that is so typical of it and is characteristic of its culture throughout all of the years. Of course, you see the ships were always a very important part of the culture. And then if you look at this statue and this pot, you see how the art is a mixture of art. You see Egyptian, you see Greek, you see Assyrian, and what it eventually all comes down to really is Cypriot. I know this exhibition went on until May of 2011, and it was accompanied by various lectures and seminars. There was an excellent catalog that was published, and it's estimated that 3 million visitors saw this. It was at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, which is one of the most popular and visited museums in Washington. So many people saw it. And the Cyprus Society came down with a bus, and we had a very fine time. So I know some of you have seen the exhibition. And as a whole, the exhibition really symbolized the fruitful collaboration and cooperation that now characterizes all aspects of archaeology in Cyprus. So this was the opening of the exhibition. So I think that kind of atmosphere is also demonstrated by tonight's event with this collaboration between the Cyprus Society of Greater Philadelphia and the Penn Museum. It's really been a pleasure for me to recall some of the museum's long and important relationship with Cyprus, and I do hope that maybe tonight's event will help to revive and revitalize some of this connection. Thank you all for coming, and I'm going to be happy to take any questions that you might have. It's little. It's a model. It's about like that. Yeah. Acropolis.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening and very beautiful lecture on science and archaeology. And I want to thank you for continuing your interest in the preservation of Cyprus antiquities. You mentioning the upcoming renewal of the Minoan and Mycenaean Imports find the good old days of 2002 when you and I worked on the first MOU that was supposed to be in Russia. I wish you all good luck for the new MOU. Just a small question concerning Mr. Cesnola. If you would, I was under the impression that they would appreciate to have saved from Cyprus one sunk off the coast of Lebanon. Can you tell us something about what's happening with that now?
I'm so glad you asked that question because I had debated whether to bring that in, especially because this museum has had such a long connection with underwater archaeology, and we saw the Kyrenia ship. Yes, when Cesnola was trying to get his antiquities off the island in a hurry as the Ottoman authorities were breathing down his neck, whether he overloaded one of the ships or what, but one of them did sink, we know. And where it sank is not really clear, unfortunately, or it would have been fun. It would have been found by now. Somewhere, I believe it went into port at Beirut and then was supposedly sailing for Italy. But it did sink. Nobody has ever found it. And over the years, there have been various serious and not so serious people that are, think they're going to try to find this ship. The last thing that I've heard about this, and it's one of these things that kind of bubbles up from time to time, and everybody gets all excited, and then it kind of dies down again. The name of the ship was the Napriad. And the most recent thing I know about it is everybody's hoping that Robert Ballard is going to get involved in the area and bring in all his sophisticated equipment, and maybe he will find it. But even whether there's even anything left to find is a question too. But anyway, it's one of those great missing shipwreck stories, and it probably had on it. I mean, he already had 16,000 objects that he sold to the Metropolitan. So whether there was anything really different or irreplaceable on the ship, who knows? But I'm sure people will keep looking. Right in the back.
You showed some animal bones that had been excavated in one of those things. Are human remains ever found? You mentioned at that point that there were none, but are they ever found?
In most excavations, they are. Unfortunately, a lot of the bones in Cyprus are not terribly well preserved. It has to do with the chemistry of the soil and so on, and a lot of them are not very well preserved. But there have been some really good studies done on human bones, not from as early a period as those animal bones I showed, but more recent periods. There's been some good ones on the Bronze Age and so on. So it's a very important field of scientific study now, and they have had some good results from various sites. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. I'm sorry, I left my Washington jargon in there. It stands for Memorandum of Understanding. And it basically is like a treaty, a bilateral agreement between Cyprus and the United States. And so that's what that little acronym means. Thank you for asking.
Wonderful and very informative talk. Thank you very much. So I just have one question before we move upstairs. These expeditions that went to Cyprus from the United States, how did they pick their sites? How did they decide where to excavate? And because I noticed in your presentation you didn't mention Paphos, which has a very rich history of excavations and antiquities. So how did you decide to go to Burion or
Well, how it's done now is different from how it was done when Penn picked Kurion.
I'm more interested in the older expeditions.
In the old days, yeah.
How did they go by finding, deciding what to excavate?
Well, when Penn picked Kurion, they were considering Paphos and Kurion. And one reason, well, I mentioned McFadden, who was supplying the money for this project. He wanted to make sure it was a site that had a place he could bring his yacht in. So that was important. And also McFadden was interested in architecture particularly. His interest was ancient architecture. And so Kurion had evidence that there was considerable architecture there. They did consider Paphos. It was a little bit too hard to get to, and it didn't have as much evidence for architecture. And he did not want to continue at Lapithos in that Bronze Age cemetery where they had been the first season because it didn't have architecture, and it didn't have a place for his yacht. So nowadays it's done. It's really sort of it's a collaboration between the Department of Antiquities and the archaeologists who are allowed to come in what they call survey, look for sites, and then they can, perhaps find one that they're interested in, and then they negotiate with the Department of Antiquities, who has to agree. Helpful.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. How are these excavations usually funded? Who funds? They're usually expensive, aren't they?
Since McFadden is no longer with us, yes. They are expensive, and most excavation directors today spend so much of their time just trying to raise money. There's some government, the National Science Foundation has supported quite a bit in Cyprus. For instance, Athenu with the field school, has been supported by the National Science Foundation for many years. Akrotiri Peninsula also has had National Science Foundation grants. National Endowment for the Humanities has funds some archaeology, but then you're also going to private donors, private foundations, and so on. Some universities provide some support or in-kind support too, but with academia these days, I think that's getting rarer and rarer. This gentleman here, and then the lady in the back, and then I think we probably need to wind up. Yeah.
I just wonder that any antiquities now found, where do they go, and what is there an agreement between the archaeologists and the Department of Antiquities in Cyprus?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Yeah, I had talked about the division of fines law that was passed in 1936 or 1926 that allowed for the division of fines, but that is no longer in existence. And with the Republic of Cyprus in 1960, nothing is allowed to go out of Cyprus. So anything that you find as a foreign archaeologist has to stay in Cyprus. And that's why this loan exhibition was such a big deal, because these things are not coming out of Cyprus anymore, except the looted and the illegal things.